The afternoon sun bathed the town of Riverton in a warm golden light. It was a peaceful suburban place where families strolled through the park, children laughed as they raced toward the swings, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings on their way to the local farmers market. Life here moved at an unhurried pace, a picture-perfect weekend unfolding in slow motion. But for Jalen Carter, today was about more than just enjoying a sunny afternoon. He had one goal: to buy the perfect birthday gift for his little sister, Aaliyah. For months, Jalen had been saving up, working extra shifts at Parker's coffee house, carefully tucking away his earnings, watching the small stack of bills grow. Every tip, every paycheck brought him closer to this moment, and finally he had enough. The gift he had chosen was special: a silver charm bracelet from Belmont Jewelers, the most prestigious jewelry store in town. He had walked past its grand window displays countless times, pressing his nose against the glass, imagining how Aaliyah's eyes would light up when she saw it. Today, he would finally make that vision a reality. With his wallet securely in his pocket, reassured by the weight of his hard-earned money, he made his way down Riverton's bustling streets. As he neared the store, the towering glass windows of Belmont Jewelers gleamed under the sunlight, reflecting the well-dressed shoppers passing by. Jalen hesitated for a moment outside the entrance, adjusting his hoodie, though it was unzipped, revealing a neatly pressed polo shirt underneath. He was well aware of the way people sometimes reacted when they saw a young black man in a hoodie, a silent stereotype that followed him wherever he went. But he shook the thought away. Not today. Just walk in, buy the bracelet, and leave. Taking a steadying breath, he reached for the handle and pulled open the heavy glass door. A soft chime rang through the air as he stepped inside. The store was just as luxurious as he had imagined. Sleek glass cases filled with glittering jewelry, velvet-lined shelves, and golden lights that illuminated every sparkling gemstone and precious metal. The scent of polished wood and expensive cologne lingered in the air. Most of the customers inside were well-dressed older women, their fingers adorned with diamond rings that shimmered as they admired necklaces and earrings that probably cost more than Jalen had earned in his entire lifetime. He ignored their curious glances, his focus locked on the bracelet he had come for. Behind the counter stood Margaret Whitmore, a middle-aged white woman with neatly styled blonde hair and piercing, calculating eyes. At first, her expression was neutral, but the moment she spotted Jalen, something shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her grip on the counter tightened ever so slightly. Her gaze, once bored, now carried a sharp, unmistakable scrutiny. Jalen felt it immediately, that shift in atmosphere, that silent question that always hung in the air whenever people like her looked at people like him. "What are you doing here?" He had seen that look before, had felt it like an invisible chain dragging behind him wherever he went. But he refused to let it deter him. Not today. With a polite smile, he approached the counter and pointed at the delicate silver bracelet displayed behind the glass. "I'd like to see that one, please." His voice was steady, calm, the way his mother had always taught him to speak when dealing with people like this. Margaret, however, did not move. She simply folded her arms and tilted her head slightly, a small smirk playing on her lips. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "That one's quite expensive." Jalen felt his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, unfolding the neatly stacked bills he had worked so hard to earn. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I have the money right here." Margaret's eyes flicked to the cash, her lips curling slightly, as if the sight of it offended her. But instead of relaxing, she only seemed to tense up even more. Her fingers twitched near the store phone resting on the counter. And still, she didn't reach for the bracelet. Instead, she let out a soft, almost amused scoff. "And where exactly did you get all that money?" The accusation beneath her words was sharp as a blade. Jalen stiffened, his fingers tightening around his wallet. "Excuse me?" he asked, though he already knew exactly where this was going. Margaret arched an eyebrow. "It's just a lot of cash for someone your age," she said smoothly, her gaze never leaving his face. "Did you, I don't know, borrow it from someone? Maybe find it lying around?" A familiar anger burned in Jalen's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. I work at Parker's coffee house, he said slowly, carefully enunciating each word. I saved up for this. Margaret made a soft, dismissive noise. She hummed, tapping her nails against the counter. And you expect me to believe that? Jalen swallowed back his frustration. Yes, he said flatly. Margaret chuckled dryly, as if she had just heard the most ridiculous joke. Well, she said finally, moving toward the display case at last. I suppose I should be flattered you thought you could fool me. But I've been working here a long time, kid. I know when something doesn't add up. Jalen's hands curled into fists at his sides. This was supposed to be simple. He had walked into this store to buy a bracelet, not to be humiliated. Can I just see the bracelet, please? He asked, his patience thinning. Margaret sighed as if he were inconveniencing her. But finally, she pulled out the velvet tray and placed it on the counter. Be careful with it, she warned, her tone sharp. It's worth more than what you probably make in a year. Jalen gritted his teeth but said nothing. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. He reached out, gently picking up the bracelet, feeling the cool silver against his fingertips. It was perfect, exactly what he had imagined. But as he turned it slightly, admiring the delicate charms, the smooth metal slipped from his fingers. The bracelet tumbled to the glass counter with a soft clink. Then it bounced off and hit the tiled floor below. The moment it happened, Jalen's breath caught in his throat. Before he could even move to pick it up, a sharp, piercing shriek cut through the store. Oh my God, I knew it! Margaret's voice sliced through the air like a siren. Every head in the store snapped toward them. Jalen's eyes widened. Wait! Margaret jabbed a finger at him, her face twisted in outrage. I knew you were up to something. You were trying to pocket it, weren't you? Thought you'd get away with it? Jalen's stomach dropped. What? No, Margaret lunged for the store phone, dialing frantically. Get the police here now, she barked into the receiver. We've got a thief. Young black male, hoodie, tried to steal from us. Jalen stood frozen. The weight of her words slammed into him like a freight train. The room had gone silent, but the air was thick with something heavy, judgment, suspicion, fear. And then, in the distance, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the air. The sirens grew louder, an eerie wail slicing through the once quiet afternoon. Jalen's pulse hammered against his ribs, his breathing shallow as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. He had known this could happen. He had seen it before. On the news, in whispered conversations, in the fear that crept into his mother's voice whenever she reminded him to be careful when he left the house. But knowing it could happen and living it were two entirely different things. Jalen forced himself to breathe, to stay still. Any sudden movement, any misplaced word could make this worse. Margaret's voice was sharp and commanding as she spoke into the phone, her free hand still clutching the counter as though she were the victim. Yes, right now. I need officers at Belmont Jewelers immediately, she barked. He's still here, trying to deny it. But I caught him red-handed. Her eyes flicked to Jalen, her lips curling into a smirk of pure satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had been expecting it. And hurry, she added, lowering her voice just enough to sound urgent. He's getting aggressive. Jalen's stomach lurched. Aggressive? He had barely spoken. He hadn't moved. And yet she was painting a picture that everyone in the room was more than willing to believe. He could feel it. The shift. The way the other customers backed away. The way a woman in a floral dress clutched her purse a little tighter. The way an older man in a suit shook his head, as though this was confirmation of what he already assumed to be true. Jalen swallowed hard, glancing at the bracelet on the floor, the same one that had slipped from his fingers only moments ago. Now it was something more, something dangerous. He took a shaky breath and looked Margaret dead in the eyes. I didn't steal anything, he said, his voice controlled but laced with barely restrained fury. You know that. Margaret scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. Oh, please, don't play innocent now, she sneered. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? Jalen clenched his fists at his sides. He forced himself to breathe. Margaret's gaze flicked over him. His hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers. Then she smirked. I know you're kind. Jalen flinched. My kind? The words tasted bitter in his mouth. He didn't have to ask what she meant. He already knew. Margaret shrugged, feigning innocence. What? You're acting all offended now? I'm just stating the facts. Stores like this deal with thieves every day, and I don't need to guess which ones are the problem. Jalen felt something inside him snap. Something cold. Something sharp. Something suffocating. He wanted to scream, to tell her how wrong she was, how disgusting, how vile. But the words choked in his throat, because in Margaret's eyes, in the eyes of everyone watching, he was already guilty. Then the store's glass doors swung open. A rush of air followed as two uniformed police officers stormed inside. The room shifted, the energy crackling like a live wire. Conversations died instantly. The customers stilled, their attention now fully on Jalen. Margaret's smirk widened. She pointed at him, her voice rising in triumph. There he is. That's him. He tried to steal from me. Jalen barely had time to react before one of the officers, a tall, burly man with graying hair and a badge reading Sergeant Blake, stepped toward him, already reaching for his handcuffs. Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them. Jalen's breath caught. His fingers twitched at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to move, to fight back against the blatant lie spilling from Margaret's lips. But he did none of those things. He forced himself to stay still, because he knew. He knew. Any sudden movement, any hesitation, and this could end horribly. Sergeant Blake's tone sharpened. I said, hands where I can see them. Jalen swallowed hard. I didn't do anything, he said. His voice was steadier than he felt. Margaret let out an exaggerated scoff. Are you seriously going to stand there and argue after I caught you? After you, she gestured wildly at the bracelet on the floor, her voice rising. Tried to pocket that? The nerve of you people. Jalen flinched again. You people! The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, Officer Doyle, hesitated. His gaze flicked between Jalen, Margaret, and the discarded bracelet. Unlike Blake, he wasn't moving in immediately. Jalen noticed the flicker of doubt in his expression. Doyle wasn't completely convinced, but it didn't matter. Blake was already stepping closer, handcuffs at the ready, his face void of hesitation. Son, I'm going to need you to step outside. Jalen felt his pulse hammering against his skull. His breathing was shallow. His mind raced through the worst possible outcomes, and every single one ended the same way, with him on the ground, with someone shouting, with a headline that started with, Black teen arrested after attempted theft. Margaret's smirk widened. Her arms crossed tighter over her chest. Her posture relaxed. She thinks she's already won. Jalen exhaled sharply, forcing his voice to remain calm. Call my mother, Blake scoffed, shaking his head. Kid, you can make your phone call at the station. Number Jalen wasn't going to let it go that far. He squared his shoulders, lifting his chin slightly. Call my mother. Now. Margaret rolled her eyes. Oh, sure, let him call Mommy, she said sarcastically. And who is she? A public defender? Some activist? What is she going to tell you to scream for justice? She let out a dry, humorless laugh. Jalen ignored her. He reached into his pocket, not fast, not sudden, just enough to take out his phone. He dialed with steady hands. Mom, I need you at Belmont Jewelers. Now. Blake's brows furrowed slightly, but he still didn't seem concerned. Doyle, however, shifted. He must have noticed something in Jalen's voice. The way he wasn't begging, the way he wasn't panicking, the way he wasn't afraid. Number Jalen wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Minutes stretched like hours. The air in the store was thick, the tension palpable. Margaret tapped her foot impatiently. Blake sighed, his grip on the handcuffs loosening slightly. Doyle checked his watch. The customers had mostly backed away, whispering to each other, some pulling out their phones. And then, the door swung open. A woman walked in, tall, commanding. Her presence alone made the entire room fall silent. A navy blue suit hugged her frame. Her heels clicked against the tile with precision, and her sharp eyes, so much like Jalen's, scanned the scene before her. She held up a badge, flashing it with an authority that left no room for doubt. I'm Dr. Simone Carter, she announced, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "Chief of Police for Riverton PD." She turned her gaze, locking onto Blake. "And this," she said, gesturing to Jalen, "is my son." A heavy silence fell over the store. Jalen barely breathed, watching as recognition dawned on the officers' faces. Sergeant Blake stiffened first, his grip on the handcuffs faltering. His body, once dominant and sure, suddenly uncertain. Officer Doyle let out a slow breath, shifting uneasily, his posture changing as if re-evaluating everything in real time. But it was Margaret Whitmore who reacted the most violently. Her expression contorted, the smirk on her lips vanishing in an instant. Shock, anger, desperation. She blinked hard as if hoping she had misheard, as if she were refusing to accept the reality standing before her. The young black man she had so easily condemned, so quickly labeled a thief, was the son of the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in town. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came out. For the first time since this started, Margaret Whitmore was speechless. Simone didn't so much as glance at her. Her eyes remained locked on Blake. Her expression was unreadable. Her presence was immovable. And when she spoke, her voice was controlled but dangerous. "Sergeant," she said smoothly, "I assume you have a reasonable explanation for why my son is standing here, surrounded while you reach for your handcuffs, before even asking him a single question?" Blake shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His jaw tensed, his hands lowered, but he didn't let go of the cuffs entirely. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "We received a call reporting an attempted theft. We responded accordingly." Simone tilted her head slightly, her gaze narrowing. "You responded accordingly." Her voice was calm, but the words carried an undeniable weight. "And by accordingly, you mean walking in here, seeing a young black man, and immediately deciding he was guilty?" Blake bristled. "That's not what happened." "Really?" Simone cut in smoothly, deadly. "Because it looks a whole lot like that to me." Margaret finally found her voice snapping out of her daze. "I called because he tried to steal from me," she blurted out, pointing at Jalen as if desperate to regain control of the situation. "He dropped the bracelet, and he was clearly about to take it. I stopped him just in time." She crossed her arms, standing firm, her voice rising in pitch. "And I did what any responsible citizen would do. I called the police before he could run off with my merchandise." Simone exhaled slowly, then turned to her son. Jalen hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even tried to explain himself. Because he didn't have to. His mother already knew. She could see it, the anger simmering just beneath his carefully composed surface, the exhaustion in his eyes, the frustration in his posture, the knowledge that even as the son of one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the city, he was still seen as nothing more than a suspect. Simone turned back to Blake. "Did you check the security footage?" Blake hesitated. "We were just about to." "No, you weren't," Simone cut in smoothly, deadly. "You were about to arrest him without reviewing any evidence, without questioning him, without doing your job." Her voice was quiet, but the authority in it was deafening. Doyle swallowed hard, shifting again. His hesitation had already been visible, but now, with the weight of the situation pressing down on him, it solidified into something tangible. He cleared his throat. "We should check the footage." Blake's eyes snapped to him. The unspoken betrayal was clear, but he couldn't argue. Not now. Not with who was standing in front of them. He exhaled sharply through his nose, jaw tightening. "Fine." Margaret's face twisted in disbelief. "What? No! I told you what happened. You're seriously going to listen to her?" She gestured wildly at Simone, then at Jalen, her voice dripping with disdain. "You saw him. You saw how he acted. This is ridiculous." For the first time since entering the store, Simone turned her full attention to Margaret. The weight of her gaze alone was enough to silence the older woman. Margaret's defiance shrank under the quiet intensity of the chief's stare, as if she suddenly realized that whatever power she thought she had in this moment was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Mrs. Whitmore," Simone said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Let me make something very, very clear to you. Margaret swallowed. You are standing in front of a boy who walked into your store to buy a bracelet for his sister. A boy who saved his own hard-earned money to support your business. A boy who you immediately labeled a thief because you decided before he even spoke that he wasn't supposed to be here. She let the words sink in. Margaret's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Simone's voice dropped to a whisper, cutting like a blade. So I hope for your sake that the security footage tells the story you claim it does. She let the words hang in the air, a tightening noose. Because if it doesn't, her lips pressed into a thin, deadly line. You will answer for every single word you just said. Margaret swallowed thickly. Her bravado was cracking at the edges. Blake cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Let's check the cameras. No one spoke as the store manager, who had been standing frozen in the background, too stunned to intervene, hurried to the back, retrieving the footage. It played on a small screen behind the counter. The silent recording displayed the exact sequence of events. Jalen entering the store, speaking to Margaret, handing over his money, the moment the bracelet slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. It was all there, every second of it. No theft, no pocketing, no crime, just a 17-year-old boy trying to buy a gift. The silence that followed was suffocating. Doyle sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Blake looked as though he had swallowed something bitter. His jaw clenched, his frustration restrained. Margaret! Margaret looked like the floor had been ripped out from under her. Simone inhaled deeply, then spoke again. Her tone was dangerously soft. So tell me, Sergeant, what happens now? Blake said nothing, because he knew better. Simone turned to Margaret. And you? Her voice was ice cold. Are you going to tell me what exactly you were so certain of? Margaret's lips trembled. She looked from Simone to Jalen, to the officers, then to the customers, who were now watching with a mixture of shock, discomfort, and, in some cases, quiet satisfaction. She started, but no words followed, because she had no defense, no justification, just the realization that she had played her hand too confidently, too recklessly, and lost. Margaret's bravado shattered in the blink of an eye. She stood there frozen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting around the room, seeking an escape, but finding none. The atmosphere in the store had shifted drastically. The weight of Simone Carter's authority loomed over them all, making it impossible for anyone to continue pretending that what had just transpired was anything less than blatant injustice. Blake, who had once stood firm and resolute, now looked like a man caught in a lie he couldn't escape. His shoulders slumped slightly, his gaze flicking from Simone to Jalen, his hand still awkwardly hovering near the handcuffs. Officer Doyle, whose hesitation had been clear from the moment Simone arrived, took another step back. He was no longer part of the show of force he had been before, his gaze now a mixture of uncertainty and regret. He had seen enough to know that the truth was on the side of the young man in front of him. Simone, still standing tall, her gaze never wavering from Blake, exhaled slowly and shook her head. The tension was palpable, the room feeling smaller with every passing second. This isn't a matter of responding accordingly, Simone said, her voice calm, but with an edge that made it clear she wasn't done. This is a matter of racial profiling, of prejudging someone simply based on the color of their skin and the clothes they wear. Blake opened his mouth, but the words never came. He was caught, cornered by the very logic he had tried to dismiss. Simone's eyes narrowed. What would you have done if he weren't my son? She asked, her voice laced with biting irony. Would you have still believed the story Mrs. Whitmore gave you? Would you have still decided his guilt without so much as a question or a second thought? The weight of her words settled into the room, and for the first time, Blake didn't know how to answer. His silence was enough to confirm everything Simone had just suggested. He had acted first, not out of genuine suspicion, but because Jalen, because of his skin color, was the kind of person who was seen as guilty before being given a chance to explain himself. Simone turned back to Margaret. Her voice, though controlled, now carried the weight of every injustice that had ever been done to her son, and to so many others. "You're wrong, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her gaze locking with the older woman's. "You thought you could make up a story and have people believe it just because of who he is. You thought that, just because of your position in this community, your word would be enough to ruin a young man's life." Margaret's face flushed with a mix of frustration and confusion. It was clear she hadn't expected the situation to unravel in this way. She had expected her accusation to be the final word, to be the end of it all. But now she found herself exposed, standing before a woman who held more than just professional authority. She held the moral high ground. Jalen, standing beside his mother, felt something stir within him. It wasn't relief. That feeling had already come and gone when his mother had stepped into the store and taken control of the situation. But it was something else, a slow, simmering sense of vindication. The truth had finally unfolded, and no one could deny it anymore. Jalen met Margaret's gaze for a brief moment. The anger that had been boiling inside him earlier had cooled, replaced by something more steady. He hadn't said much during the whole ordeal, and yet the weight of his silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to plead his innocence. His mother's presence, her calm authority, and the evidence spoke for him. Margaret seemed to shrink under his gaze. Her posture shifted, and the defiance that had once been so easy for her to wear like armor now crumbled beneath the scrutiny of Simone's sharp eyes. I don't understand," Margaret stammered, her voice wavering slightly. "He dropped the bracelet. He was acting strange." Simone sighed, her voice low but carrying the weight of experience. "You labeled him as strange because of what he looks like, because he didn't fit into the mold of the young man you expected to walk into your store." Margaret blinked, still trying to process, still clinging to the narrative she had created. Simone shook her head. "You never took the time to understand who he really was. You never bothered to ask him anything. You just decided he was guilty from the moment he walked through that door." A moment of silence stretched between them. Margaret's bravado was now gone. She had no defense. The evidence was clear. The security footage didn't lie. Jalen had done nothing wrong. Simone exhaled, her gaze softening, just a little, as she turned back to her son. Her eyes were full of pride, but there was something else there too, something tired. She knew that this victory, though important, was just a single moment in a long, ongoing fight. But today, for this moment, she would let it be enough. "Let's go home, baby," Simone said, her voice gentle but firm. Jalen nodded silently, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. His mother had done what no one else had done for him in that store. She had seen him. She had seen his worth. She had made sure everyone else saw it too. As they turned to leave, Simone reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The door to Belmont Jewelers swung open again, the soft chime ringing in the background. The store manager, who had stood by silently this entire time, didn't make a move to stop them. The room was still, and everything seemed frozen. Jalen walked past Margaret one last time. Their eyes met, and for a moment Jalen felt the weight of everything he had endured in that store, everything his mother had just confronted. And as he passed her, he spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice clear and steady. "But I guess I got something more valuable instead." Margaret didn't respond. She simply stood there, rooted to the spot, her expression unreadable. The reality of what she had done to him, to a young boy who had just wanted to buy a gift for his sister, was now fully sinking in. She had tried to use her privilege to crush him, but in the end, it was her own actions that had been exposed for all to see. Simone walked out of the store with Jalen by her side, her hand firmly holding his. The moment was over, but the fight was far from finished. As Jalen and Simone stepped out of Belmont Jewelers, the heavy glass door swung shut behind them with a soft thud, closing off the chaos and tension that had unfolded inside. But even as the door sealed off the scene, the weight of the moment seemed to follow them into the streets. The calm afternoon had returned to its usual rhythm, with pedestrians strolling past the boutique, unaware of the storm that had just passed through. Jalen's chest felt tight, as if the pressure of the past few minutes had yet to release its hold. He looked up at his mother, who walked beside him, her steps steady and purposeful. Despite the triumph of the moment, there was a quiet exhaustion in her posture, a weariness that spoke of years spent fighting battles like this one. She hadn't just confronted a store clerk. She had confronted a system that too often failed to see the humanity in people like Jalen. Simone was a chief of police, the top-ranking officer in Riverton, but it wasn't her badge that had gotten them this far. It was her resolve. It was her unwavering belief that Jalen deserved the same respect and dignity as anyone else. No matter where they were, no matter who was watching. She knew this wasn't just about the bracelet or the false accusation. It was about a far bigger problem, one that her son, despite his mother's rank, would continue to face for the rest of his life. Simone didn't speak as they walked to her car, the sharp clicking of her heels on the pavement filling the silence between them. Jalen had never felt more keenly the divide between the world he lived in and the world his mother inhabited. Even with her power, her influence, and her education, this fight was still never truly over. There would always be someone else who would look at him and see danger. Someone else who would decide who he was before ever bothering to ask. When they reached her car, Simone opened the door, but Jalen hesitated. He glanced back toward Belmont Jewelers, the reflection of the store's shiny windows catching the light of the late afternoon sun. Inside, he could still imagine Margaret standing behind the counter, her face drained of its earlier defiance, replaced with the realization of just how deeply she had gone wrong. "Mom, what happens now?" Jalen asked, his voice heavy. "What's next?" Simone paused, her fingers brushing the keys of the car as she prepared to start it. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a long, steadying breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Now," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "now we make sure Margaret Whitmore answers for what she did. This isn't just about a mistake. This is about accountability. And if she gets away with this, if she doesn't face the consequences, then what happened today won't be a lesson for anyone." Jalen's brow furrowed. "What are you going to do?" Simone looked over at him, her expression unwavering. "First, we start with the press." She started the car, the engine rumbling to life as she eased into the street. "I'm calling for a press release immediately. I want the public to know exactly what happened in that store today, and I want them to understand why it's wrong. I want people to know that racial profiling doesn't just hurt the person it's aimed at. It hurts the entire community." Jalen sat back in his seat, his hands resting on his lap, fingers curling into fists and then releasing. It wasn't just the fight with Margaret that made his chest tight. It was the reality of what his mother was doing. Simone wasn't just fighting for him today. She was fighting for every single person who had been wrongfully accused, every person who had been stereotyped, every person who had been treated as less than human simply because of the way they looked. She was turning their experience into something larger, something that demanded attention. Simone glanced at him, her eyes softening just for a moment. "But it's not just about Margaret," she added quietly. "I'm going to make sure Sergeant Blake answers for his actions as well. If we allow officers to treat people like Jalen was treated today, based on assumptions, not facts, then we've failed as a society. We've failed in our responsibility to serve and protect everyone, equally." Jalen felt his heart swell, a mix of pride and something else he couldn't quite name. His mother's words were more than just a speech. They were a promise that even when the world didn't see him, she would always see him, and she would fight, always fight, to make sure the world saw him too. As they drove through the streets of Riverton, Jalen looked out the window, watching the world go by. He had spent his entire life trying to fit in, trying to be seen as someone who belonged, who wasn't defined by the color of his skin. But today, for the first time, he realized that fitting in wasn't the goal. What mattered was being seen for who he really was, not for the assumptions people made, but for the person he truly was. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, interviews, and meetings. Simone's decision to speak out had sparked a ripple effect. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Belmont Jewelers was all over the local news for the wrong reasons. Customers began sharing their own stories of racial profiling on social media, and the store's Yelp page became flooded with one-star reviews. People were beginning to speak out, and the issue of systemic racism was back in the public eye, where it belonged. Simone and Jalen both knew the fight wasn't over. Public pressure could force change, but it didn't guarantee it. Margaret Whitmore had been placed on indefinite leave, and rumors swirled about her potential firing. But that wasn't the end of it. Sergeant Blake had already been placed under review. An internal investigation launched after body cam footage revealed just how quickly he had resorted to handcuffs without evidence. The process would be slow, but it was a start. And that start could lead to a future where things were different for people like Jalen. 2 days later, Jalen sat on the couch at home, his phone buzzing in his hand. He had just come from another meeting with his mom, discussing the ongoing public review and the progress they were making with their lawyers. But today he had an appointment with Aaliyah, the little sister who had inspired this whole journey. She bounded into the room, grinning from ear to ear, the silver bracelet dangling on her wrist. "Look what Mom got me," she squealed, holding her arm out excitedly. "It's perfect, Jalen." Jalen smiled at her, a sense of peace washing over him for the first time in days. He hadn't been able to get the bracelet for her himself, but this moment, this connection with his sister, was worth more than anything he could have bought. "I'm glad you like it, Aaliyah," he said, his voice steady. Aaliyah's smile brightened even more. "Are you sure you didn't get it for me?" she asked, tilting her head. "Because I thought it was you who picked it out. It's just perfect." Jalen let out a soft laugh. "I guess it was both of us." And in that moment, Jalen knew something that was more important than any gift he could give. No matter the struggles, no matter the injustice, his love for his sister, for his family, was more than enough to keep him fighting. The world could be unjust, could be cruel and cold, but it was this, family, love, and the belief that change was possible, that kept him going. And for the first time, it felt like the fight was really worth it. The days following the events at Belmont Jewelers were a whirlwind of emotions, actions, and consequences. As the town of Riverton slowly moved on with its quiet suburban pace, the ripple effects of that afternoon continued to reverberate through the community. Jalen felt the weight of it all, a heavy, unrelenting pressure on his shoulders. His mother, Simone Carter, had taken the first step in calling attention to the racial profiling that had nearly cost Jalen everything. But he knew the fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. The news coverage of the incident was relentless. Belmont Jewelers became the face of a larger conversation about racial injustice, with people from all over the country weighing in. The store's reputation had been tainted, the story picked up by both local and national outlets. The backlash was swift, and the store manager, who had remained quiet throughout the entire ordeal, was forced to make a public apology. Margaret Whitmore, the store clerk whose actions had set everything in motion, had gone into hiding, and her future with the company was now uncertain. As for Sergeant Blake, the officer who had so quickly reached for his handcuffs without any consideration for the truth, he had been placed under review. An internal investigation was underway, and despite the resistance from some of the force, the evidence was undeniable. The body cam footage of Blake's swift escalation was now public knowledge, and his actions had been scrutinized in ways he could not ignore. Simone, though, wasn't celebrating. This wasn't about her triumph. It was about making sure the system would be held accountable. As chief of police, she had made it clear that there would be no tolerance for any form of misconduct or prejudice within the department. Her stance on racial profiling was unwavering, and she had taken steps to create more community outreach programs aimed at preventing incidents like this from happening again. Jalen, however, couldn't help but feel the weight of it all differently. Though the publicity had been overwhelming, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the battle, the real battle, was still to come. His thoughts often wandered back to that moment when he stood in Belmont Jewelers, feeling the eyes of every customer on him, the way their suspicion had boiled over into something he couldn't control. How easily they had turned their backs on him, siding with the store clerk and believing her word over his. His heart tightened just thinking about it. It was early one morning when Simone sat down beside him at the kitchen table. The air was still, and the house was quiet. Aaliyah had already gone to school, and the noise of the day hadn't started yet. Simone's expression was calm, but there was something about the way she sat that told Jalen she had something important to say. She looked at him, her eyes soft, yet filled with a quiet resolve. "Jalen," she started, her voice low and steady, "there's something I need to prepare you for." Jalen looked up, his brow furrowing in concern. He had been through a lot, but his mother's tone told him that whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be easy. "I've just spoken to some of the officers at the precinct," Simone continued, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "They're worried about the impact this will have on their department. They've been pushing for me to back down." Jalen's stomach dropped. "Back down? Why?" he asked, his voice catching. "You're doing the right thing, Mom. You're doing the right thing for everyone." Simone exhaled slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "It's not about right or wrong anymore, Jalen," she said softly. "It's about power." Jalen's chest tightened. He knew this was coming, but it still felt like a punch in the gut. "You're talking about the people who hold the power in this town, right?" he asked. "The ones who have influence, who don't want things to change?" Simone nodded. "Exactly." Jalen's thoughts swirled. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep the issue went. It wasn't just the incident at the jewelry store or the officers involved. It was about a larger system that hadn't been built for people like him. It wasn't just the police force. It was the entire structure of Riverton. The whispers, the assumptions, the little acts of exclusion, the things that couldn't be seen unless you were in the shoes of someone who had been there their entire life. The quiet discrimination had woven itself into every part of the town's fabric, into the way people looked at him, into the way he felt less than every time he stepped into certain places. And this battle, this fight for fairness, was about more than just him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like he had. But the challenge wasn't just changing people's minds, it was about changing a whole system that had been in place for generations. Simone, reading the thoughts written on her son's face, placed a hand on his arm. "I want you to understand," she said softly. "This fight, it's not going to be easy. The people in power don't like to lose control. They don't want to change things because it's comfortable for them. And I'm going to need you to be stronger than you've ever been before. Because the road ahead will get messier, but you can't let them break you." Jalen nodded, his lips pressed together. His mother had been through so much in her career, but now it felt like the stakes were higher than ever before. This wasn't just about her career or his future. It was about making sure that someday no young man would ever have to stand in a store and feel the same fear he had felt. It was about creating a world where justice wasn't just a word, it was a reality. As they sat there in silence, Jalen felt the weight of his mother's words settle deep into his heart. He had always looked to her for guidance, but now he understood that the work ahead wasn't just about her. It was about both of them. They were going to fight this together, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized. Simone gave him one last look, full of pride, before getting up from the table. "We've got a long way to go," she said. "But I'm with you, Jalen, and I always will be." Jalen watched her go, feeling a newfound strength in himself. His mother had always been the rock he leaned on, but now he realized that it wasn't just about following her lead. It was about taking his place in this fight, his voice in this conversation, and his heart in this cause. He wasn't just a teenager from Riverton anymore. He was a part of something bigger, and he wasn't going to let anyone silence him, no matter how hard they tried. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Belmont Jewelers and the events that transpired within its walls continued to unfold. Simone and Jalen's voices, along with the voices of others who had been silenced for far too long, were making waves, demanding change. But for every victory, there was still a long road ahead, a road full of resistance, full of people who didn't want things to change. But Jalen knew one thing for sure. This fight was far from over, and with the strength of his mother beside him, he was more than ready to see it through. The days that followed were filled with action and reflection. Jalen and Simone both worked tirelessly, each in their own way, to ensure the events of that afternoon would lead to more than just fleeting headlines. As the news story grew, so did the support from their community. People from all walks of life came forward, sharing their own experiences of injustice, of being seen as less than, of being judged by assumptions instead of truth. Jalen felt the weight of it all differently now. His once quiet life in Riverton, where he had simply tried to get by, had turned into something far more significant. The community began to see him differently, not as a victim or as a statistic, but as a catalyst for change. Simone had been unwavering in her commitment to hold the police force accountable. She pushed for transparency, demanding that the internal investigation into Sergeant Blake be thorough and fair. She even called for a community meeting, bringing together residents, law enforcement, and local leaders to discuss how to improve relations between the police and the people they were sworn to protect. The ripples of the story spread. Belmont Jewelers was forced to answer for its treatment of Jalen, and the store's management issued an apology to the public. Margaret Whitmore was placed on indefinite leave, and although rumors swirled about her potential termination, the long-term impact of her actions had already been felt. The store's reputation had been tarnished beyond repair. But for Jalen, the real victory wasn't in the apology or the public outrage. It was in the fact that his voice had been heard. And it was in the quiet moments, like the one he shared with his sister Aaliyah, when he realized that the fight was no longer just about him. It was about the future, about making sure Aaliyah and every other young person growing up in Riverton would never have to face the same challenges, the same assumptions, the same dehumanization. He had made a promise to himself that day as he had walked out of Belmont Jewelers. A promise to fight for change, for a world where people weren't judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Where justice wasn't a rare occurrence, but a consistent, unshakable foundation. Weeks later, as he sat with his mother in their living room, Jalen reflected on everything that had transpired. He had seen the worst of people, but he had also witnessed something incredible, the power of resilience and accountability. Simone had always told him that change didn't come easily, that it was a fight, but it was a fight that was worth every ounce of effort. Simone glanced at him, her eyes soft, but still holding that same fire they had shared when they walked into Belmont Jewelers together. She had pushed through her own doubts, her own fears to do the right thing. She knew this was just the beginning of a larger movement. There was more to be done. "You did good, Jalen," she said, her voice full of pride. Jalen nodded, his lips curling into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We did good, Mom." Simone looked at him with a new understanding, her words carrying more than just parental affection. They were words of deep respect. "The fight's not over, but we've made a dent, and that's something to be proud of." She paused, then added, "But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about confronting the people who were wrong. It's about changing the system. It's about creating a world where someone like you can walk into any store, any place, and be seen for who you really are, not just the color of your skin." Jalen's heart swelled with pride, but also with a sense of resolve that had settled in his chest. This fight wasn't his alone. It was shared by everyone who had ever been marginalized, misunderstood, or silenced. His journey was a part of something much bigger than him. It was the beginning of change, not just for Riverton, but for communities everywhere. And though the path forward would not be easy, Jalen felt ready. As he sat there with his mother, feeling the warmth of her presence, he realized that the lesson they had learned together was simple, yet profound. It was about accountability. It was about understanding that justice wasn't something that just happened. It was something you had to fight for every single day. But it was also about hope. The hope that even in the face of adversity, you could make a difference, that you could change minds, change systems, and change lives. And above all, Jalen had learned this. No matter how hard the fight, no matter how deep the injustice, your voice is powerful. It's the one thing no one can take from you. It's the one thing that can ignite real change. As the sun set outside their home, casting long shadows across the room, Jalen made another promise to himself. He would never be silent again. The battle for justice was far from over, but Jalen knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning.